The radio crackled to life at 3:47 hours, cutting through the pre-dawn silence of forward operating base Sentinel like a blade through silk. Major Kalin, Ghostbird, Voss should have been dead. The A-10C Thunderbolt II she'd taken up for what command called a routine reconnaissance sweep had vanished from radar 17 minutes earlier, somewhere over the jagged mountains of the Helmand province. The last transmission from her aircraft had been 3 words, delivered in that maddeningly calm voice that had earned her both respect and resentment among her squadron: taking effective fire. Now her call sign was bleeding through the static again, but something was wrong. The voice coming through the comm system carried an edge that Ghostbird never showed, a tremor that made the hair on Captain Marcus Webb's neck stand on end. He'd flown with her for 8 months, had seen her thread an A-10 through a canyon so narrow the wingtips nearly kissed stone, had watched her place 30 rounds with surgical precision while taking fire from 3 directions. Ghostbird didn't shake. Ever. Sentinel Base, this is Ghostbird Actual, the transmission continued, each word carefully measured. I'm inbound, 02 minutes out. Clear the approach, I've got complications. Webb leaned forward in the air traffic control tower, his coffee growing cold as he squinted into the darkness beyond the runway lights. Nothing moved in the sky except stars. Below, the emergency crews were already scrambling, their vehicles painting streaks of red and amber across the tarmac. The base commander, Colonel Sarah Chen, stood rigid beside the radio operator, her face carved from granite. Ghostbird Sentinel Base, what's your status? Do you require medical assistance? The radio operator's voice cracked slightly on the last word. Silence stretched for 5 heartbeats. 10. Then, negative on medical, but you might want to wake up intel. I'm bringing back something they're going to want to see. The first hint of her approach came not as sound but as a feeling, a subtle vibration in the control tower's windows that made Webb's teeth ache. Then, emerging from the purple darkness like something conjured from a pilot's fevered dream, came the distinctive silhouette of an A-10 Thunderbolt II. But this wasn't the aircraft that had departed 17 minutes ago. This machine looked like it had been through hell and decided to bring some of it back. The port engine nacelle was completely gone, sheared away by something that had left jagged metal edges gleaming in the runway lights. The vertical stabilizer hung at an impossible angle, held on by what looked like prayers and hydraulic fluid. But somehow, impossibly, Major Kalin Voss was flying it home. The Thunderbolt moved through the air with the graceless determination of a wounded animal, each second of flight a victory against physics itself. As the aircraft passed overhead, Webb caught a glimpse of something that made his blood run cold. Strapped to the external hardpoint where a Maverick missile should have been, something metallic glinted in the approach lights, something that definitely hadn't been there when Ghostbird had taken off. The radio crackled one last time before landing. Sentinel Base, Ghostbird, I found what's been shooting down our birds, and I brought back proof. Major Kalin Voss had earned her call sign Ghostbird, not through any supernatural ability, but through something far more practical and infinitely more dangerous. She had the uncanny talent of appearing exactly where the enemy least expected her. In the 18 months since her deployment to Afghanistan, she had developed a reputation that preceded her like morning fog, silent, inevitable, and utterly without mercy when the situation demanded it. Her squadron mates had initially resented the call sign, thinking it sounded too mystical, too feminine for the brutal business of close air support. They preferred names that spoke of violence and machinery: Hammer, Ripper, Sledge. But Ghostbird had a way of making her presence felt in the cockpit of an A-10 that transcended their crude understanding of warfare. She didn't announce herself with thunderous engine roar or dramatic maneuvers. Instead, she would materialize from behind a ridgeline or emerge from a cloud bank with the quiet lethality of a hunting owl. Her 13 GAU-8 cannon speaking its 7-barreled sermon before her targets even knew death was calling. The irony wasn't lost on her that she flew one of the loudest, most intimidating aircraft in the Air Force inventory. The A-10 Thunderbolt II, affectionately known as the warthog, was designed to be seen and heard, a psychological weapon as much as a kinetic one. Its twin turbofan engines produced a distinctive whine that struck terror into enemy positions, while the GAU-8 cannon created a sound like the world's largest zipper being torn apart. But somehow, in Ghostbird's hands, even this beast of burden became an instrument of stealth. Her background hadn't prepared anyone for her success in combat aviation. Born in rural Montana to a family of wheat farmers, she'd learned to fly crop dusters at 14, navigating by instinct over endless fields where a moment's inattention could mean death by power line or grain silo. Her father, a Vietnam veteran who rarely spoke of his service, had taught her that the sky demanded respect, patience, and an intimate understanding of how machines and humans failed under pressure. These lessons, learned over wheat fields under big sky sunsets, would prove invaluable over the mountains of Afghanistan. The path to military aviation hadn't been straightforward. After graduating from Montana State with a degree in aeronautical engineering, she'd worked for 3 years as a civilian flight instructor, building hours and watching too many of her male colleagues receive opportunities she was passed over for. The September 11th attacks had changed everything. She'd walked into an Air Force recruiting station on September 12, 2001, with a simple declaration: "I want to fly and I want to serve." What followed were 4 years of training that would have broken lesser pilots. Flight school, where she finished third in her class despite facing instructors who seemed determined to prove she didn't belong in a cockpit. Survival training, where she'd spent 2 weeks in the Nevada desert living off rattlesnake meat and cactus water. Weapons training, where she'd learned to thread a missile through a window at 3 miles. And finally, A-10 training, where she'd fallen in love with an aircraft that most pilots considered a flying tank with all the aerodynamic grace of a refrigerator. But the Warthog suited her perfectly. It was honest, brutal, and utterly without pretense, qualities she recognized in herself. The aircraft could absorb tremendous damage and keep flying, could loiter over a battlefield for hours, could place ordnance with surgical precision or carpet an area with devastating area of effect weapons. Most importantly, it was designed to support ground troops, to be the guardian angel that infantry soldiers prayed for when the world turned dark. Her first combat deployment had been Iraq in 2006, flying close air support missions over Anbar province during some of the war's bloodiest fighting. She'd proven herself in the crucible of urban combat, providing danger-close fire support that had saved dozens of American lives. But it was her second deployment, to Afghanistan, where she truly made her mark. The mountains of Afghanistan presented challenges that the flat deserts of Iraq couldn't match. Here, weather could change in minutes, turning clear skies into violent storms that could tear an aircraft apart. The terrain offered countless hiding spots for enemy fighters armed with surface-to-air missiles and anti-aircraft guns. Most dangerously, the high altitude and thin air meant that aircraft performance was degraded, leaving little margin for error. It was in this environment that Ghostbird had developed her signature tactics. Rather than announcing her presence with high-speed passes, she would approach targets at low altitude, using terrain masking to hide her approach until the last possible moment. She'd learned to read the landscape like a book, understanding which valleys would funnel sound away from her targets and which ridgelines would provide cover for her attacks. Her kill record was impressive, but it was her ability to provide precise fire support without causing civilian casualties that had truly set her apart. The other pilots in her squadron had gradually come to understand that their initial skepticism had been misplaced. Ghostbird wasn't trying to prove she was tougher or more aggressive than they were. She was simply better at the job than most of them would ever be, and she did it with a quiet professionalism that made their chest thumping seem adolescent by comparison. She didn't need to announce her victories or embellish her stories. Her reputation spoke for itself. But respect was a fragile thing in military aviation, and Ghostbird knew that one mistake, one moment of weakness, could destroy everything she'd built. As she fought to control her damaged A-10 through the treacherous approach to Fob Sentinel, she couldn't help but think that this might be that moment. The question wasn't whether she could land the aircraft. She'd already proven that by getting this far. The question was whether anyone would believe what she'd discovered in those 17 minutes of hell, and whether they'd take action before more aircraft and aircrew were lost to the threat she'd identified. The approach lights of Fob Sentinel stretched out before her like a constellation fallen to Earth, each bulb a beacon guiding her home. But home felt very far away as she nursed the crippled Thunderbolt through the mountain air, her cargo strapped to the wing serving as both proof of her discovery and a reminder of how close she'd come to joining the growing list of aircraft lost to unexplained mechanical failures. Behind her, somewhere in the darkness of the Hindu Kush, an enemy was waiting, and Major Kalen Ghostbird Voss was the only person who knew exactly what they were facing. The landing was less a controlled descent than a barely managed catastrophe. Ghostbird's A-10 touched down hard on runway 9, sparks cascading from the damaged landing gear as the aircraft fought every input she gave it. The port engine, what remained of it, was streaming smoke that turned amber in the runway lights, while hydraulic fluid traced a dark line across the concrete behind her. Captain Webb watched from the tower as the Thunderbolt rolled past the first turnoff, then the second, eating up runway at an alarming rate. The emergency vehicles were packing the aircraft now, their red and blue lights painting the scene in urgent strobes. At the 3,000-foot marker, Ghostbird finally managed to coax the aircraft into a shuddering turn onto the taxiway, the screech of tortured metal audible even through the tower's thick windows. "Jesus Christ," Webb whispered, forgetting protocol entirely. In 8 years of air traffic control, he'd never seen an aircraft that damaged make a successful landing. The fact that it was still in one piece was a testament to both the A-10's legendary durability and Ghostbird's skill as a pilot. Colonel Chen was already moving, her boots echoing against the tower's metal stairs as she headed for the flight line. Behind her, the intelligence officer, Major David Santos, scrambled to keep pace, his laptop bag bouncing against his hip. Whatever Ghostbird had brought back, it was about to become the most important piece of intelligence to come out of this sector in months. On the taxiway, the Thunderbolt finally rolled to a stop beside the maintenance hangar, its engines winding down with mechanical groans that sounded almost alive. Steam rose from various damaged components, creating ghostly wisps in the cool mountain air. The emergency crews surrounded the aircraft immediately, but their chief, Master Sergeant Rodriguez, held them back with a raised hand. Until they knew what was strapped to that external hardpoint, nobody was getting close to the aircraft without proper authorization. The canopy opened with a hydraulic hiss that carried across the flight line like a sigh of relief. Major Kalen Voss emerged from the cockpit with the careful movements of someone who had been holding herself together through pure force of will, and was now allowing her body to acknowledge what it had endured. Her flight suit was dark with sweat despite the cold mountain air, and her hands shook slightly as she removed her helmet. But her eyes, those sharp green eyes that had earned her a reputation for seeing things others missed, were absolutely steady as they swept the scene around her aircraft. She took in the emergency crews, the gathering crowd of maintenance personnel, the approaching figures of Colonel Chen and Major Santos. When her gaze finally settled on the object strapped to her wing, her expression hardened into something that made Webb's blood run cold. "Nobody touches that until Santos gets a look at it," she called out, her voice carrying easily across the flight line. "And I mean nobody. Not maintenance, not ordnance, not the base commander himself." Colonel Chen reached the aircraft as Ghostbird was climbing down from the cockpit, accepting the crew chief's offered hand with uncharacteristic grace. Up close, the damage to the Thunderbolt looked even worse. The port engine nacelle wasn't just gone. It had been sheared away by something that had left heat-stressed metal and char marks along the fuselage. The vertical stabilizer was held on by what looked like a single hydraulic line and prayer. How she'd managed to fly this thing home, was beyond comprehension. "Major," Colonel Chen said simply, offering the kind of nod that acknowledged both the successful mission and the fact that Ghostbird was still breathing. "Report." "Ma'am," Ghostbird replied, coming to attention despite the obvious fatigue in her stance. "At approximately 3:30 hours, I observed what appeared to be a missile launch from coordinates 34, 2 degrees N, 68, 7 degrees E. Upon investigation, I discovered a surface-to-air missile site of unknown configuration. The site engaged my aircraft with what I believe to be a laser-guided surface-to-air system of foreign manufacture." She paused, glancing back at her aircraft. "I was able to evade the initial engagement and conduct a counterattack, destroying the primary launcher. During the engagement, I recovered a component of the missile system." Her eyes moved to the object on her wing. "I believe this device is responsible for the recent aircraft losses we've been experiencing." Major Santos had been circling the aircraft like a predator, his trained eyes taking in every detail of the damage and the mysterious cargo. Now, he approached the wing-mounted object with the careful movements of someone who understood that intelligence could be more explosive than any conventional warhead. The device was roughly cylindrical, about 3 feet long and 8 inches in diameter. Its surface was a matte black that seemed to absorb the hangar lights, and along one side, Cyrillic characters were barely visible beneath carbon scoring. At one end, a complex array of sensors and what looked like a guidance system were housed behind a transparent dome that had somehow survived both the missile's destruction and its journey home strapped to an A-10's wing. "Russian?" Colonel Chen asked, moving to stand beside Santos. "Russian-made, certainly," Santos replied, pulling a small camera from his bag. "But look at these modifications." He pointed to a series of components that had been clearly added to the original design. "This isn't standard Soviet-era hardware. Someone's been upgrading these systems with modern electronics." Ghostbird watched the intelligence officer document her prize with the satisfaction of someone who had just delivered exactly what she'd promised. "There are more, ma'am," she said quietly. "I counted at least 3 additional launch positions during my egress. This wasn't a single-point defense, it was a network." The implications hit Colonel Chen like a physical blow. For 6 weeks, they'd been losing aircraft to what appeared to be random mechanical failures or pilot error. 2 F-16s had gone down during routine patrols, both pilots killed when their aircraft simply fell out of the sky with no distress calls or apparent cause. A helicopter had crashed during a supply run, all 4 crew members lost. Each incident had been investigated thoroughly, but no common cause had been identified. Now, looking at the missile component strapped to Ghostbird's wing, a darker picture was emerging. They weren't dealing with isolated attacks or mechanical failures. They were facing a coordinated air defense network using advanced weaponry that was somehow evading their detection systems. "How many people know about this?" Chen asked. "Just us, ma'am," Ghostbird replied. "I maintained radio silence after the engagement until I reached base airspace." "Good," Chen turned to Santos. "I want this thing in a secure facility within the hour, full analysis, and I want preliminary results by dawn." She looked back at Ghostbird. "Major, you're grounded until medical clears you, but first I want a complete debrief. Everything you saw, everything you remember down to the smallest detail." As if summoned by the colonel's words, the base medical officer appeared at Ghostbird's elbow, already reaching for her wrist to check her pulse. "Ma'am, if you could come with me." "In a minute, Doc," Ghostbird said, gently extracting her hand from his grip. She turned back to Colonel Chen, and for a moment her professional composure slipped just enough to reveal the strain she'd been under. "Ma'am, there's something else. The way they engaged me, it wasn't random. They knew I was coming." The silence that followed her words was deafening. Around them, the normal sounds of the flight line, aircraft engines, ground crews, radio chatter, seemed to fade away, leaving only the weight of implication hanging in the mountain air. "Explain," Chen said simply. The missile site was positioned to cover the exact route I took on my reconnaissance sweep, not the planned route, the route I actually flew. They knew where I would be before I got there. Ghostbird's eyes were hard now, the kind of hardness that came from understanding that the game had just changed in ways she couldn't fully comprehend yet. Someone's been watching us, ma'am, and they've been planning this for a while. The debriefing room in the intelligence section of Fob Sentinel was a windowless box that smelled of coffee and paranoia. Major Santos had converted it into a makeshift analysis center, with laptops, communication equipment, and photographic gear spread across every available surface. On the wall, a large monitor displayed satellite imagery of the coordinates where Ghostbird had encountered the missile site, though the resolution was too poor to make out details. Ghostbird sat across from Colonel Chen and Santos, her flight suit replaced by standard-issue ACUs, a steaming mug of coffee warming her hands. The base medical officer had cleared her for duty after determining that her only injuries were minor cuts from ejection seat straps and some bruising consistent with high-G maneuvers. But the real damage, Santos suspected, wasn't physical. "Start from the beginning," Chen said, activating a digital recorder. "Everything from takeoff to touchdown." Ghostbird took a sip of coffee and began. Her voice was steady, professional, but Santos noticed how her eyes occasionally flicked to the satellite imagery on the monitor, as if she was trying to reconcile what she'd experienced with what they could see from space. "I departed Fob Sentinel at 3:15 hours for a routine reconnaissance sweep of grid squares 42 RPQ and 42 RPR. Weather was clear, visibility unlimited, winds light and variable. I proceeded south-southwest at 15,000 feet AGL, following what I designated as Route Charlie." She paused, looking directly at Santos. "Route Charlie was not my planned flight path." "Explain," Santos said, leaning forward. "Standard procedure calls for following ridge lines to minimize exposure time over hostile territory. My filed flight plan had me following the Margaza River Valley, then turning east toward the reconnaissance area. But when I reached the initial point, I observed what appeared to be vehicle movement in the valley. I made a tactical decision to alter my route, proceeding instead through the Shirzed Pass." Chen and Santos exchanged glances. The Shirzed Pass was notoriously dangerous terrain, narrow valleys, unpredictable winds, and multiple concealed positions that could hide anti-aircraft threats. Most pilots avoided it entirely. At approximately 3:25, while transiting the pass at 12,000 feet AGL, I observed a flash consistent with a missile launch from the southern ridge line. Ghostbird's voice never wavered, but Santos noticed her grip tighten slightly on the coffee mug. Initial bearing was approximately 180 degrees relative, range estimated at 3 miles. "Visual identification?" Chen asked. "Negative. The flash was brief, and I immediately initiated evasive maneuvers. I rolled inverted and pulled toward the deck, using terrain masking to break the missile's line of sight. At that point, I was more concerned with survival than identification." Santos made notes on his laptop, cross-referencing the timeline with radar data from the base. "Our radar shows you disappearing from coverage at 3:27. That matches your time frame." "Yes, sir. I was flying nap of the Earth through the valley system, probably below your radar horizon." Ghostbird set down her coffee and leaned forward, her eyes focusing on something beyond the walls of the briefing room. "That's when I got my first good look at the missile site." She described it in the methodical way of a trained observer. A camouflage position built into a natural rock outcropping, virtually invisible from above but commanding excellent fields of fire across the valley approaches. Multiple launch positions, connected by what appeared to be fiber optic cables. Most importantly, sophisticated radar and optical tracking systems that had clearly been recently installed. The launchers themselves were mobile, probably truck-mounted systems that could be moved quickly, but the command and control equipment was permanent, built into the rock face. Whoever set this up intended to stay. Santos was typing rapidly, trying to keep pace with her descriptions. How many missiles did you count? I never got an accurate count. I was taking effective fire from at least 2 positions, possibly 3. But based on what I observed during my attack run, I'd estimate a minimum of 12 ready missiles, probably more in reserve. The room fell silent as the implication sank in. A dozen surface-to-air missiles positioned to cover the primary air routes into and out of FOB Sentinel represented a threat that could effectively shut down air operations in the sector. Combined with the sophisticated tracking systems Ghostbird described, it explained why previous aircraft had been lost with no warning. "Walk me through your attack," Chen said. Ghostbird's expression hardened slightly. I made a decision to engage the site rather than attempt to evade and return to base, given the threat it represented to future air operations, and the fact that they had already fired on me. I felt immediate action was warranted. It was a carefully worded justification for what amounted to a solo assault on a heavily defended position, exactly the kind of aggressive action that had made Ghostbird's reputation and occasionally put her at odds with more cautious commanders. I approached from the west, using a ridge line to mask my approach until I was within effective cannon range. The A-10's GAU-8 is optimized for ground attack, and I was able to achieve tactical surprise. She paused, and for the first time, something that might have been satisfaction flickered across her features. I engaged the primary launcher with a sustained burst, approximately 200 rounds of 30 depleted uranium. Santos winced involuntarily. The GAU-8 cannon was designed to destroy armored vehicles, and 200 rounds would reduce most ground installations to scrap metal and smoke. The target was destroyed, along with what appeared to be a command trailer. However, during my egress, I took hits from at least one additional launcher. That's when I lost the port engine and sustained damage to the vertical stabilizer. "But you managed to recover this missile component," Chen said, nodding toward the photograph Santos had taken of the device. "Yes, ma'am. During the explosion of the primary launcher, a section of missile guidance system was thrown clear of the blast area. I was able to maneuver close enough to capture it with my aircraft's external cargo hook." Ghostbird's eyes met Chen's directly. I felt that positive identification of the threat was critical for future operations. The understatement was almost laughable. Flying a damaged aircraft at low altitude through hostile terrain to recover a piece of enemy equipment was the kind of action that earned either a medal or a court-martial, depending on how it turned out. Santos looked up from his laptop. "Major, you mentioned earlier that you believe the enemy knew your flight path in advance. What makes you think that?" "The positioning of the launchers, sir. They weren't set up to defend a fixed target or to provide general area coverage. They were specifically positioned to engage aircraft transiting the Shirzad Pass, the exact route I chose to take." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "The only way they could have known to position themselves there is if they had advanced knowledge of our operational patterns. Or," Santos said quietly, "if they had real-time intelligence on your flight." The possibility hung in the air like smoke. The idea that enemy forces might have access to their communication systems or operational planning was almost too frightening to contemplate. It would mean that every mission, every flight, every movement was potentially compromised. Colonel Chen stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the concrete floor. "Major Santos, I want that missile component analyzed by our best people, full technical intelligence workup, and I want to know everything, who made it, where it came from, and how it got here." She turned to Ghostbird. "Major, you're to discuss this incident with no one outside this room until further notice. As far as the rest of the base is concerned, you experienced mechanical failure and returned safely." "Yes, ma'am," both officers replied simultaneously. As they prepared to leave the briefing room, Santos caught Ghostbird's arm. "Major, off the record, how close did you come to not making it back?" Ghostbird considered the question for a moment, her green eyes distant. Closer than I'd like to admit, sir, but that's not what worries me. She looked back at the satellite imagery on the monitor. What worries me is that this was just one site, and if they've got this valley covered, what else don't we know about? The technical analysis of the missile component began before dawn, conducted in a secure facility deep within the base's intelligence compound. Major Santos had assembled a team of specialists. Sergeant First Class Maria Reeves, a former Navy EOD technician with advanced training in foreign weapons systems. Technical Sergeant James Liu, an electronics warfare specialist. And Captain Amanda Foster, a Russian linguist with extensive experience in Soviet-era military hardware. What they found painted a picture that was both fascinating and terrifying. This is definitely a 9M38 surface-to-air missile system, Sergeant Reeves announced, looking up from her disassembly of the guidance section. Part of the SA-11 Buck family, originally manufactured in the Soviet Union in the late 1980s. She pointed to a series of markings on the internal components. But look at this. The modifications were extensive and sophisticated. Modern GPS guidance systems had been integrated with the original radar homing mechanism. Digital signal processors had been added to improve target discrimination. Most significantly, the missile's warhead section had been completely redesigned to incorporate proximity fusing that would detonate the weapon close enough to damage aircraft without requiring a direct hit. Someone spent serious money upgrading this system, Captain Foster said, examining photographs of Cyrillic markings under magnification. These modifications aren't field expedient, they're professional-grade engineering. Technical Sergeant Liu was focused on what appeared to be a communication module hidden deep within the guidance package. "Sir, I think you need to see this," he called to Santos, who was reviewing satellite imagery at a nearby workstation. The communication module was no larger than a smartphone, but its implications were staggering. Embedded within its circuitry were components that Liu recognized from advanced electronic warfare systems, devices capable of intercepting and decoding military radio communications, GPS navigation data, and even encrypted command signals. "This thing is basically a sophisticated listening post," Liu explained, his voice tight with concern. "It can monitor multiple frequency ranges simultaneously, decode various signal types, and transmit intelligence back to a command center via satellite uplink." He paused, studying the device more closely. "But that's not the scary part." "Go on," Santos said, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to hear the answer. "The scary part is that it's still active. Even after being blown up and dragged back here on the wing of an A-10, it's still trying to phone home." The silence in the room was deafening. Santos felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air outside. "Are you telling me this thing has been broadcasting our location since Major Voss brought it back?" "Not exactly," Liu said, quickly disconnecting a wire harness. "The transmission capability was damaged in the explosion, but the listening components are fully functional. If this thing had remained intact at the missile site, it would have been capable of intercepting and analyzing every radio transmission we make." Santos reached for his secure phone to call Colonel Chen, but stopped when Sergeant Reeves made a discovery that changed everything. "Major, come look at this," she said, her voice strained. She was examining what appeared to be a maintenance log embedded in the missile's computer memory. "These aren't just Soviet missiles that someone upgraded. Look at the production dates." The log showed maintenance entries going back only 6 months, all in English, all referencing procedures and part numbers that were clearly from recent manufacturing. But what made Santos's blood run cold were the location codes scattered throughout the maintenance records. "These components were manufactured in Iran," Reeves said quietly, "but the final assembly was done somewhere in Pakistan, and the electronic warfare modifications." She looked up at Santos with wide eyes. Major, some of these parts have American NSNs, national stock numbers, they're U.S. military components. The implications crashed over Santos like an avalanche. They weren't just facing an enemy with sophisticated weapons. They were facing an enemy that had access to American military supplies, possibly through official channels. Someone was providing advanced military technology to hostile forces, and those forces were using it to kill American servicemen and women. Captain Foster had been quietly working her way through the Cyrillic markings with a magnifying glass and reference materials. Now she looked up with an expression of barely controlled anger. "Sir, there's something else. These markings aren't just manufacturing codes, they're unit designations. Russian unit designations." Meaning? Meaning this missile didn't just come from Russia, it came from an active Russian military unit. Specifically, the 76th Guards Air Defense Regiment based in Pskov. She set down her magnifying glass with shaking hands. "Sir, that unit is currently deployed to Syria." Santos felt the room spinning around him. The missile that had nearly killed Major Voss hadn't just been supplied by a foreign power. It had been supplied by Russian military forces currently engaged in combat operations in the Middle East. The same forces that were supposed to be coordinating with American operations through diplomatic channels. "Shut everything down," he ordered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Secure all materials, sanitize the work area, and prepare everything for immediate transport to higher headquarters." He looked around the room at his team. "And nobody, and I mean nobody, discusses what we found here with anyone outside this facility." As his team began the careful process of packing up their analysis equipment and securing the missile components, Santos considered the bigger picture. Major Voss had stumbled into something far larger than a simple air defense site. She had uncovered evidence of what appeared to be a coordinated effort by foreign powers to target American military operations using advanced weapons systems and intelligence capabilities. The question was no longer just how to neutralize the threat in the Shirzad Pass. The question was how deep the conspiracy went, and how many other American lives were at risk from an enemy that seemed to know their every move before they made it. Outside the secure facility, the sun was rising over the Hindu Kush Mountains, painting the peaks in shades of gold and red. It should have been beautiful, but Santos could only think about how many hidden threats might be lurking in those valleys, waiting for the next American aircraft to venture into their kill zones. Major Voss had brought back more than just a piece of enemy equipment. She had brought back proof that the war they thought they were fighting was not the war that was actually being fought against them. And somewhere in those mountains, an enemy with American technology and Russian weapons was preparing for their next engagement. The secure satellite communication went through at 800 hours local time, connecting FOB Sentinel directly to the Pentagon's Joint Intelligence Operations Center. Colonel Chen sat in the base's secure communications facility, flanked by Major Santos, and a pile of photographic evidence that told a story she wished she didn't have to share. On the screen, a collection of senior officers and intelligence analysts listened with expressions that grew increasingly grim as she outlined Major Voss's discovery. General Patricia Hawkins, the theater commander, interrupted several times to ask for clarification, her voice crackling through the encrypted link with barely controlled anger. "Colonel, you're telling me that a single pilot stumbled across what amounts to a coordinated intelligence operation involving Russian military assets and possibly compromised American equipment?" General Hawkins' image flickered slightly on the satellite feed, but her displeasure was crystal clear. "Yes, ma'am. The evidence strongly suggests that our recent aircraft losses weren't due to mechanical failure or pilot error, but to a sophisticated air defense network using advanced weapons and real-time intelligence." Chen gestured to Santos, who began displaying technical photographs of the missile components on the conference system. "The implications go beyond just the immediate tactical threat," Santos added, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was reporting. The electronic warfare capabilities we discovered suggest that hostile forces may have been monitoring our communications and operational patterns for months. Every mission we've flown, every tactical plan we've developed, may have been compromised. The silence from the Pentagon end of the link was deafening. Finally, a voice that Chen recognized as belonging to Admiral Rebecca Walsh, the Joint Chiefs Intelligence Director, cut through the static. "What's the status of the pilot who made this discovery?" "Major Voss is currently grounded pending a full debriefing and medical evaluation," Chen replied. "She's been instructed to maintain operational security regarding the incident." "I want her flown to Bagram immediately for extended debriefing," Admiral Walsh said. "And I want every piece of that missile shipped to CONUS for full technical analysis. This goes beyond theater-level intelligence. We're looking at potential national security implications." General Hawkins leaned forward on the screen. "Colonel, effective immediately, all air operations in your sector are suspended pending a full threat assessment. No aircraft leave the ground without my personal authorization." The order hit Chen like a physical blow. Suspending air operations meant that ground forces,